Last year, a group of a dozen Canadian cartoonists traveled to Havana, Cuba, to meet with our counterparts there. It was the first Canadian cartoon convention to be held outside of Canada, and what a blast it was. This was all organized by Wes, so Wes, tell us about that.
Yeah, you know, Terry, I think Terry's still buzzing on it, much the way I am and much the way some of our colleagues are out here. We went down, we were able to see people that we don't know. We met them, a lot of them for the first time, these other cartoonists, and they were so positive and they were so sweet and charming. In fact, many of them were doppelgangers, like you would go and actually see, like that guy looks just like Terry, and that guy, and there was actually a Graham Mackay. In fact, one of our cartoonists, Graham Mackay, was so mistaken for the Cubans, they put him in charge of a hotel and called him El Jefe. So it was quite fun for us, and we're still talking about it to this day, much to the chagrin of my beautiful wife. And we're so excited because we were able to bring folks who we don't get to see very much of, including our next very special guest. Patrick Chapette was difficult enough because he was so charming and good looking, and this is bad for guys like me and Terry. And this other next fellow is really bad for us because he will steal your wives away very quickly. He's so beautiful and charming. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a fellow that was raised as a golden boy in California. At some point during the Nixon administration, the fragrant aroma of British Columbia brought him to Vancouver. He stayed for the last 40-odd years. And Terry will tell you. Dan also produced my favorite all-time Canadian cartoon book back in the time Dwayne Bobbitt, was it? Yes, the Wayne Bobbitt.
Wayne Bobbitt. Yeah. So Dan did 101 uses for a severed penis. So he's a zany guy, and I think you'll... It's really a cute book, quite a wonderful book. Anyway, he also did this cartoon right after the Muhammad cartoons, very puzzled about the process, so he kind of drew himself, I think, saying, a cartoonist tries to heal a hurt. So what about a connect the dots, Muhammad? Like, would that work? And again, recently with this one.
Yeah, he did his own, immediately after the scenario in Paris, he did his own mock-up Charlie Hebdo cover, which is quite good.
Like, how would Charlie Hebdo cover this,
yeah,
right?
And what the joke was on them, because the martyred cartoonists are greeted in heaven by 72 well-seasoned hookers.
So as you're going to see, the Canadians can't help themselves. Of course, it was very solemn, but they've continued to be sort of cheeky throughout this whole thing.
Yeah, we're very, very blessed, ladies and gentlemen, to have really one of the most charming folks you're ever going to have the great pleasure to meet. And as the Cubans call him, Senor Dan, please welcome to the stage Mr. Dan Murphy.
Come on, Dan.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you. I live in British Columbia now. That is where your plans for world domination involve yoga wear, where you order coffee by PowerPoint, and where you believe if any statue deserves an eternal flame, it is a statue of Marc Emery. When I landed in BC, I started doing cartoons like this for a West Coast daily. And in my 29 years with the Vancouver province, my only confrontation with terrorists was a meeting with HR. But I did have some run-ins with religious institutions. For example, when I did this cartoon, after we found out that the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff had slipped Duffy 90 grand under the table, my syndicate artisans got this email from the Bank of Canada telling us that we had to can the cartoon because it's now against the law to portray Canadian money in a less than religious light. So facing a possible fine and jail time and maybe unraveling the country by undermining Canadians' faith in their monetary system, we did the only thing we could. we animated the cartoon.
Yo, Mark Carney of the Bank of Canada here to present our new $90,000 bill with 3 state-of-the-art anti-counterfeiting safeguards. Safeguard number 1, held up to the light, the Nigel Wright hologram winks at you. Safeguard number 2, it smells like bacon. And safeguard number 3, when you squeeze it, it belches. Canada, you ain't seen nothing yet.
So we posted this on Facebook and YouTube and Twitter along with that email, and we have not heard back from the Bank of Canada. I do some work for the Cartoonist Rights Network. Cartoonist Rights was founded in 1992 by Robert Russell. Robert heard that there was a Sri Lankan cartoonist being harassed by his government. Robert got in touch with that cartoonist's family and asked what he could do to help. And that's what Cartoonist Rights has been doing ever since, finding cartoonists around the world who are being censored or threatened or jailed, and asking what it can do to help while trying to get their stories out there. Cartoonists like Musa Kart in Turkey, who in 2005 was taken to court by his prime minister, Mr. Erdogan, over this cartoon, showing the prime minister as a cat tangled up in campaign promises. Now, the Turkish people have a long history of loving cartoons. Turkey's first satirical magazine was started in 1869. And Turkey's leaders have a long history of hating cartoonists. Sultan Abdülhamid II, the last ruler of the Ottoman Empire, sentenced the fellow who started this first magazine to 3 years in jail over a cartoon suggesting that Turkey's censorship laws were overly harsh. So what do Turkey's cartoonists do when one of theirs is in trouble for drawing the prime minister as a cat? They slap this on the cover of one of their next magazines. The prime minister as a giraffe, the prime minister as a monkey, the prime minister as a frog, the prime minister as just about everything except a blood-sucking tick. The blood-sucking tick prime minister got its own cover. And what do Turkey's cartoonists do when they hear that colleagues in Paris have been killed at the offices of Charlie Hebdo? They run these covers. There have been those who have tried to co-opt the Hebdo tragedy to fit their own agenda, to fit into that template of us versus them. There have been Islamophobic groups like Pegida in Europe, anti-immigrant politicians like the former Katzenjammer kid Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. But the world's cartoonists, for the most part, did not play that us versus them game. The evidence is in the cartoons they produced after the tragedy. Cartoonist Rights has compiled most of those cartoons into a slideshow from cartoonists from all over the world, from every religion, who don't necessarily agree with what the Hebdo cartoonists said, but agreed in their freedom to say it. Le Mans' editor said that of the Hebdo cartoonists, not only were they friends, but they knew Turkey well. This photograph is of Hebdo cartoonist George Walensky, taken outside one of the main mosques in Istanbul, where he was, according to the caption, sketching with awe. The Le Mans editor wrote that the killers massacred 3 generations of cartoonists who were only using the most important gain of the French Revolution, freedom of thought and expression. And that's important to remember, that freedom of thought and expression was a hard-won gain for Europeans, that there was a time there when a Torquemada or a Savonarola could cart you off and kill you in the name of another religion. And it wasn't that long ago. The last Inquisition trial was in 1834. Goya's Disasters of War, that famous series of prints which stands testimony to the savagery of European kings and clergy, which has inspired political cartoonists and illustrators like Kathy Kollwitz and Brad Holland. The disasters of war were not made public during Goya's lifetime for fear of a knock on the door. They weren't published until 35 years after he died. So some of the exuberance of a cartoon like this has to come from knowing that just a handful of generations back, this would have gotten you burned at the stake. This is the cartoon that Musa Kart did following the Hebdo killings. Musa was fined for that Erdogan cat cartoon, and last year, the now President Erdogan wanted Musa tossed into jail for 9 years for this cartoon, showing the president as a hologram oblivious to government corruption. This time a protest was mounted by Martin Rosen, cartoonist for the Guardian newspaper, who started an Everyone Draw Erdogan campaign. Cartoons were tweeted and retweeted, and eventually it kind of went viral. And there's a lesson here. If you're planning on running a country and you don't like cartoons, you shouldn't tell anybody. Because if you do, well, this is how people in Turkey reacted when Erdogan announced he was going to ban Twitter. So, what makes pictures powerful? How come they can grab us like they do? I think it's wound up in our DNA. I think we are genetically inclined to make marks and to try to divine the marks made by others. We're still pondering these marks. And this was possibly a political cartoon. We just haven't realized it because the all-important political cartoon label had not been invented. And this might have been an early PowerPoint presentation by some prehistoric pundit on maybe how all this mastodon extinction talk is just a lot of hooey. We can only wonder what these early extinction deniers might have looked like. So cartoons might be powerful. That still doesn't explain why so many potentates and politicians and homeroom teachers regard cartoons with equal measure terror and outrage. Well, you know that Shelley poem about Ozymandias, the ruler who had fame and power and wealth beyond belief? I'm going to use a stand-in for Ozymandias here. Fame, power, he's dating the Beyonce of his day. And so he decides to build a giant statue to himself, 5 stories high. And 1,000 years later, Shelley's traipsing through the desert and stumbles across this statue, and only the legs are left. Well, judging from the Ozymandiases of our day, what worried Ozymandias when he was alive wasn't what his statue was going to look like in 1,000 years. What worried Ozymandias when he was alive was somebody sneaking up and drawing a dick on his statue. Are doing this, which took effort. Because however powerful you are, however big your statue is, once somebody draws a dick on it, that's going to get people laughing. And once people are laughing, that's going to bring you right down to size. And once you're right down to size, people are going to be able to honestly evaluate you. Cartoonists, if they're doing their job, draw a lot of dicks on a lot of statues. Political cartoons, if they're doing their job, undermine pomp, question authority, and encourage a skeptical eye. And these are 3 things that scare and mortify a lot of very powerful people, which is why Syrian cartoonist Ali Ferzat had his hands broken by agents of President Bashar al-Assad. Ali Ferzat's hands healed. Which is why Iranian artist activist Atena Farghadani was 2 weeks ago handed a 12-year sentence for protesting a move to roll back women's rights in Iran with this cartoon of her country's parliamentarians. Which is why Mohammed Sabaneh, a Palestinian cartoonist, this is one of Mohammed's cartoons, why Mohammed Sabaneh was tossed into prison by this guy because of cartoons, and when he got out of the slammer, was released from his job for a while by this guy because of a cartoon. Which is why Malaysian cartoonist Zunar in 2010 had his books banned and was charged with sedition by the government of Prime Minister Razak. Zunar countered by suing Malaysia for the theft of his civil rights. Zunar is a force of nature. He was in North America last year when he heard that a Malaysian appeals court had lifted the book ban, saying that the government had acted unreasonably and irrationally, and threw out the sedition charge, saying that ridiculing politicians does not threaten public order. But Zunar returned home only to have his latest book banned, only to get hit by 9 new sedition charges, carrying a possible 43-year prison sentence for some tweets he made. The sedition charges were made under a law brought in by the British when Malaysia was a colony. It was a law meant to keep the lid on anti-colonial activity. It's a law that at one point Prime Minister Razak promised to wipe from the books. Razak has now decided not only to keep the law, but to beef it up as well. And any law that adds visual representations, that's what cartoonists do, adds visual representations to the list of possible terrorist activities, that's a law to worry about. This is not from Malaysia's Beefed Up Sedition Act, by the way. This is from Bill C-51, which became law a few days ago. Will it censor cartoonists? It doesn't have to. It just has to put enough of a chill in the air that editors and cartoonists start to censor themselves. It just has to get people worried about that knock on the door. There's a documentary called From My Syrian Room. It's by cartoonist Hazem Al-Hamwi, and it is about being an artist in Syria during a civil war. It's a movie that will break your heart and connect you to people you didn't know an hour before. After a screening of the movie in Vancouver, one of the producers, Zaina Zeradin, was asked if she thought freedom of speech was in danger in the West. She said what she knew is that when governments take freedoms away, they do it slowly. They do it incrementally. At first, she said, you'll hardly notice. Maybe one of the ways you notice is that there are fewer satirists and political cartoonists around. Maybe the West is beginning to realize, since Charlie Hebdo, what the rest of the world has known for quite a while, that political cartoonists are kind of like the canaries in the coal mine when it comes to free speech. Zunar has proposed that January 7th, the day of the Hebdo killings, be proclaimed World Cartoonist Day by the United Nations. I'm hoping that a proclamation of a day to celebrate satire and free speech and political cartoons includes the unveiling of a giant statue, 5 stories high, of a dick. And I'm hoping once it's unveiled, cartoonists from around the world can go up and scrawl a caricature of their country's leader on it. Thank you. That's for Anne. Oh, thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Bill. Thank you.